Yo, let's go. What's up, y'all? Saturday afternoon. Today we are covering The Monks of War by Desmond Seward. We're going to dive right into it. This is about the military religious orders. So today we're covering Knights Templar, Teutonic Order, Hospitallers, and Assassins. And I thought this would be something a little different, than our typical literary analysis. And people have been asking me to do, what up, TGF? People have been asking me to do, to go back and do Victorian literature. And yes, and I'm going to do that. But I just also thought that it occurred to me, why don't I go way back? Why don't I go way back into something that I personally have always been interested in, which is reading about the Templars, the Crusades, and the medieval era. I thought that it would be cool. It would be sort of a different topic for a Saturday afternoon. So I went back and reread this book by Desmond Seward called "The Monks of War: The Military Religious Orders." I read it again 20 years ago. I read this in February of 2002 in my final year of university. And it's funny because with these books, I mean, I remember reading them like it was yesterday, but apparently it's been 20 years. So I went back and reread and just refreshed myself. Also because the other day, JD, our homeboy over there, JD was doing the talk with Rachel, not Rachel based homeschool mom, but different Rachel, psychologist Rachel, and over at Jay's Analysis. And one of the things they mentioned was the Assassins, and they were talking about cults, and they mentioned the cult of the Assassins. So I thought, I consider myself pretty well read and know a good bit about the Assassins, but I thought I would just refresh myself and go back into my library here, into some literature, and try to find some textual material about the Assassins, and of course, reading about the Knights Templar and all of the medieval warrior monk orders. So I thought that it would be a cool thing to cover. What we're going to do is basically I'm going to take you through, as we always do. We look at form plus content equals meaning. Of course, today we're not doing a work in the canon of literature. We're going into a work of history. It's pretty well sourced. It's a decent book. I've got some problems with it, but we'll get to those. But it's a good book. And I thought we would go and read, we would look at the evidence, especially about the thing which a lot of you, exactly, Crisp knows. Yep, Hassan, the old man in the mountain. That's exactly what I'm going to talk about. Crispy is dialed in. So we're going to talk about Ibn Hassan, and we're going to look at some of the evidence for who were these assassins? What were they? The Hashishin. We're going to look at, see if we can find anything more about the old man in the mountain. There's so many characters that come out of this. I mean, the Crusades is the breadth of the Crusades is pretty wide, but I think that everyone is, as with a lot of the literature that we've done, you go back and look at and look at the text, and a lot of times your vision of history or your vision of literature will become distorted over time based on other things that you've read, things people say, the common, the connotations of words or the common understanding of certain things. And as with a lot of the literature that we've covered, you go back and look at the evidence in the text and just simply look at the words on the page. And sometimes you remember what you thought from the very beginning and how it's sort of become warped over time. And you go back to what the thing actually is. Now, one example of that would be certain things about the Knights Templar, the Crusades in general, and about the Assassins. And I think that it was refreshing for me going back and rereading this book. I have a whole library of books on the Grail, legends, analysis of the Grail, medieval literature, poems of Provence, the Crusades, Crusader literature, books about the Templars specifically. I mean, I love this topic. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people get really into this topic, and you can understand why. And I think that going back, it's one of the things that I was specifically looking for this time was about what we all know or what we've heard, especially in the conspiracy world over in our corner here, about the things dealing with the Templars, right? and about the reasons for the Templar immolation, right, and the destruction of the Templars. And I think that my thesis statement about this is essentially that I think that the destruction that the Templars were okay. Let me try and sort this out. I grew up thinking the Templars were one thing, right? And you learn about the Crusaders, and you think that their destruction was completely unfair, and that it was at the hands of these greedy people who wanted to take over and basically spewed lies. And that's a common thought, and that was always mine. And then as time passes, you start to read and hear more things about the specific rituals that caused the downfall of the Templars. And you start to question, well, why would they admit to these things and so forth? I know I'm making it very simplistic, but it's a lot more complex of an issue. But my thesis statement in the end is essentially that I'm sure that the Templars and certain military orders were involved with if not outright heresy, they were with sort of Gnostic rituals, etc. And I think that a lot of times the Templar rituals were probably confused with Cathar rituals. But I think that overall that the Templars were who they said they were, and that the things that they were accused of for specific reasons by the actual people that were doing those things. And the reason I say that is because what do we see in the world now, right? What do we see they mentioned this on stream the other night, how the term gaslighting is ever used, but and that is absolutely true. But what do we see in culture and in media now all the time is that the people, the elites, the oligarchy, the establishment, the power structure will do one thing and then accuse you of doing that very thing, right? Which is essentially the definition of gaslighting, isn't it? And I think that that's exactly what occurred with the Templars. I'm just going off the evidence in the literature. So I think that it'll be interesting to look at some of the accusations and some of the accusations aimed at the Templars. And one thing that I sort of remembered and that I'd forgotten is the idea that the Crusades was a monumental, huge time in history, right? It was huge. It lasted a long time. It involved all of Europe. It was essentially a world war in a way. And I think that it's, one thing is that people often forget that this involved so many people and it involved so much energy. One thing that I'd completely really just, it slipped my mind over time is the fact that Spain functioned as a sort of a branch of the Holy War, a branch of the Crusades for 700 years. And it's I don't think it's forgotten about in terms of history or academia, but I certainly had placed my sort of mental energies directly in the Holy Land itself rather than in Spain. And this book makes a good case for the fact that, a lot of the Spaniards at the time tied in with the noble houses and the royal houses, et cetera, and the masters of the temple, which is what you call the people who were in charge of the various Templar branches, were often asked, come to the Holy Land and fight. And they were like, look, we got our own Holy Land here. This is the land of St. James. And we need to, we got our own problems here because they were literally being taken over. And I think that another thing is that we often think of these things associated with the Templars, as a secret society. And certainly now the major secret societies have become offshoots of the Templars. I mean, the Masons, et cetera. But the Templars themselves were not really, people may have a problem with this, but they were not really a secret society. They were open. Not open in the sense that anybody could join and be a Templar. They essentially served as shock troops, but that they were, and I'm sure that, and again, I'm sure that it's more complex and complicated. And they certainly did have rituals, but they were open in the sense that you can still go and read the literature of the Templars, the establishment of each temple. You can still read their constitution, and the establishment of the Templars and their what they were accused of, their last words, the history. And now that's not to say that that is something that you could believe is valid. I mean, look at now. Anybody in 1,000 years coming back and looking at now at the official history of whatever's going on is obviously going to have a huge problem with that, right? But what I will say is that they were accused of things that I think they were being accused of things that the accusers themselves were doing, which is essentially satanic, isn't it? So thank you all for being here on this nice, what day is this? Saturday? Is it Saturday? Is it weekend? Thanks for being here on this Saturday afternoon. Again, just for anybody coming in, we're going to be covering this book, this history, the historical work, The Monks of War. I'm also going to be looking at a couple other things just as sort of a tangent when we get to them. And, I think that also before we keep going, please make sure, everybody, that you smash that like. And thank you for continuing to share. And also, if you see the links in the video description or the channel description, you can support me on any of those three ways: Cash App, PayPal, Venmo. I always appreciate it. And also, I got some. Let's see. I got a couple of people supported me over the past couple days. Let me find who super chatted. Let's see. One was, Andrew Martin supported me. Thank you so much for that PayPal today. Really appreciate you, Andrew Martin. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much, homie. And thank you to Devin, who supported me on the last one, $5. Thank you to everybody who supported me. I really appreciate you guys. And shouts out to my homeboy, West Lexicon Media, WLMACR. Who is my homeboy and who just sent me a message, and we got some big things coming. And I think you guys are going to enjoy it. We're doing a film analysis next week, which is going to be really, really dope. Thank you to Kristen, my homegirl out there, Slow Boy Whiteboard, for always being based and for sharing my content. Thanks to TGF. Thanks to former Ghost out there. Shouts out to Jethro and to Jerry, who are out there working hard on a Saturday, doing their various things. Shouts out to my homeboy Mixkey out there, Natesky. Thank you to Natesky, the Kang. Thank you so much. All right, so let's get going, you guys. One more thing. Yeah, I saw that the new Elvis movie. JD said all of Tennessee went, and he now sees what Nick Cage meant by the big E energy. Yeah, well, and that's dope. So I can't wait to see this movie. Anybody who knows me, and I guess you guys probably know this, anybody who knows me knows that I love Elvis. I love Elvis. I mean, look, I got Elvis trappings all around here. Look, I got my ashtray ready right here. Right? I love Elvis. I love Elvis. See? I love Elvis. So I can't wait to see this movie. And if you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen that I did a while back an Instagram live on the book Last Train in Memphis by Peter Garelnick, which is a biography of Elvis. And I talked about various Elvis stories. I've got Elvis books all around here. So I think that what I'm going to do, my next thing is, I think I'm going to check out the new Elvis movie, the Baz Luhrmann Elvis movie, see if it's any good. I said on that last stream that one of my friends from drama school, Antonia Bernath, played Priscilla in the movie. I think I said Jonathan Rhys Davies. I'm sorry, dumbass moment. No, Jonathan Rhys Myers. If I can even remember his name, he played Elvis, not Jonathan Rhys Davies. That's the guy who was, Indy, you were named after the dog? After the dog? Right? Not that guy. That guy's too big to play Elvis. So I'm going to go watch that. And then I think I'm going to cover a couple of these Elvis books about Elvis, because it's time we do a work of analysis about some music analysis. So I think we'll do that next time. What do you guys think about that? Right, TCB. So let's dive into this. This is Desmond Seward, The Monks of War. Now, one thing I'll say about this book right away is that it's interesting that, Desmond, so if you probably never heard of him, but, he's an English academic. Of course, he's a Cambridge academic, etc. But one thing that he makes clear right away in this historical analysis is that he is a member of the current Order of St. John, which is the Knights of the Hospitaller, which, it includes, which is basically, as far as I know, is essentially charity work. Is a hereditary organization, but essentially does charity work. There is still a Knights Templar, the official Knights Templar around that also does charity work, also hereditary organization. I actually have an old friend who is a Knight Templar, and we're not talking like the local Masonic hall. We're talking it's a big thing. Now, it's not, as far as I know, it's not Luminate confirmed. Now, I think that the real successors to the Knights Templar are the various organizations that we all know of that I can't really name here, and that do, specific things. But just right away, he makes it known that he's in that organization. So that to me kind of, I mean, I guess he's an objective historian, but there are parts of the book where, as we said, nobody's completely objective. Of course, everybody, we have this thing about like, oh, you're a journalist or a historian, you're completely, dispassionate. It's like, no, everybody, we're human beings. We all have our opinions, right? Shouts out to Kristen at Slow Boy Whiteboard, based Slow Boy Whiteboard. Thank you so much, Kristen. I love you so much. You're always supporting me, and I love you, homegirl. You're the best. So thank you so much. All right, so let's dive in here right away. There is a quote from Bernard of Clairvaux. So I'm just going to talk about the history of this. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was a monk of the Cistercian order. And essentially, if any man is responsible for the warrior monks and the holy orders of the medieval era, and the Crusades, it would be Bernard of Clairvaux. I've actually been to a couple of the Cistercian abbeys. There's Rievaulx and there's Clairvaux. And, Bernard is an interesting figure on his own. He essentially, what happened was, you guys will know this, so forgive me for going over this, you know this, but people may watch this later, especially that don't know anything about this, and that's cool. Essentially what happened was that the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and the Middle East was taken, Palestine was taken over by by Islam in the first millennium, right? And this was particularly offensive to the orders of monks and to the royalty in Europe, the European royalty especially. And Bernard really marshaled a group of influential people and said, "Hey, let's go over and take it back." Okay. You're getting a lot of secondhand smoke from me. I'm sorry. I'll try and keep it here in the library. Okay. The three great orders of the time were the Templars, the Hospitallers, it's where we get the hospital, right? And the Hospitallers ended up including the Knights of Malta, the Maltese cross, and the Teutonic Knights. And I especially liked reading about the Teutonic Knights because we hear about the Teutonic Knights, and the book makes clear to establish that what the Teutonic Knights came to represent in the 20th century, essentially by a group of people in a certain country in Europe that begins with a G, is not really what the Teutonic Knights were. In fact, they were not bound by any sort of RACIAL bonds or bonds of German nationalism. They were essentially bonded by a Christian nationalism. And their crusade was kind of the, not number 3 crusade, but it was the third front of the crusade, which was the Balkans. And the Teutonic Knights were responsible for fighting the pagans on the northern borders of Europe, especially in what we now see as Ukraine and Lithuania and Germany. The Teutonic Knights are also solely responsible for the state of Prussia. one thing to understand about these guys, the Templars are obviously the biggest one. Knights Templar are by far the biggest and most powerful of these warrior monk groups. And one thing to understand is that they weren't a secretive society where you didn't know like who was a Templar, right? You're in a crowd of people. They were a huge, massive organization. They were all over the place. They owned masses of property. And that is one of the things, that's one of the reasons, that's one of the things that caused their downfall in the end, because, as you probably know, they were they established the system of European and later global banking because they had so much wealth from their conquests and from their financing that later they would end up financing royals. And one of the people that they financed was Philip IV in France. Was it Philip IV? I think it was Philip IV, who essentially his avarice overtook him, and he was bent on the destruction of the Templars wholesale. And of course, just as a side note, that's where we get Friday the 13th, right? Friday the 13th was the date of the arrest of all of the Templars in Europe. And this was a major coup. And it's interesting because it's kind of a counter coup, although a fictional counter coup, because they claimed that the Templars were going to do a coup d'etat in France and take over the government. There's no evidence that they were going to do that. Why would they do that? They owned all this property and all this, their influence was massive, and it was more than just one single state. The Templars did have their own single states that they basically, they were a law unto themselves, but they were also beholden to their holy orders and to the Pope, etc. And they amassed so much wealth. They had so much property that it was when the coup happened and they were taken over, and they ended up being beheaded, burned at the stake, all these things. They were tortured, and all of their wealth was absorbed, was stolen by various figures of royalty throughout Europe, including in England, Scotland, in France, in Germany. And the only ones that really survived were the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights Hospitaller are different from the Templars in that their major focus was on establishing hospitals. Now the hospital for the soul, right, and the church, we have the proxy of that, which is the actual hospital, meaning that the Templars were established to protect the lines of pilgrimage from Europe into the Holy Land, which then morphed into them fighting and taking over the Holy Land, right? And the Knights Hospitaller were also, a warrior monk class, but were focused on establishing hospitals where people suffering from, various diseases, typhoid, leprosy, etc., would be taken care of. And these were huge. They were huge establishments, which is another reason why, it's a misconception that, I know it's a common misconception in academia that, the Dark Ages weren't actually dark. Well, I would actually disagree with that. We've already talked about the implosion of Rome and what it caused throughout Europe and the loss of all of this stuff. But they are right in the sense that there was a great amount of learning and a great amount of innovation that occurred during the Middle Ages. And the Templars and these orders were the driving force behind that. Mainly because one of the reasons is because they sort of incorporated this synergy between the Middle Eastern world of Islam and the West, right, and Western Europe, where you can see it in their artwork and their portraiture and their architecture, where they were Western Christian European warrior monks, but the names of their castles, the names of their lands, and even the way that they dressed and how they started to intermarry with the population started to take on a Middle Eastern flair, right? Yes, TGF says that's why hospitals use the red cross on the white background and the caduceus snake rod symbol, an homage to the Knights Hospitaller. Absolutely right. And one of the things that's interesting, one of the things that I find so interesting about this is that, we're talking about a time where there's there is a distance of thousands of miles between, not only between kingdoms, between countries, between nations. So if there were nations at the time, and also between Europe and the Middle East, and yet the news travels fast. There certainly is, like, it's amazing how fast people get to know things and about the interconnectedness of Europe, especially as far as the Templars go. And that's one of the things that the Templars and these groups established, was that, their orders were the same no matter where you were, and their rituals were the same. The things that they did and that they believed in were the same, even though their language was different. And you had thousands of miles separating them. So in other words, a Templar castle in Portugal can be the same as a Templar, a priory or a Templar fortification or castle in London, which to me is amazing, because we don't really think of it that way. It says, I'm going to read some of the introduction here. It says, this is an introduction to the military religious orders, the first general history of them since the beginning of the 18th century. It's pretty cool. This book was published in 1972. Now there's a huge, there's been an explosion in literature and historical work and analysis of the Middle Ages, especially the Crusades. The best book I can recommend on the Crusades would be Henry Treece, The Crusades. Great book. And that book, the thing I always remember about that book is that in the middle of one of the Crusades, when all these people are fighting each other, in comes the scourge, the so-called scourge of God, Genghis Khan, and absolutely annihilates everyone in his path. Comes, does all this stuff, and then disappears. And the number of historical figures, the huge personalities that are in this era, I mean, it's crazy, right? Of course, we know Jacques de Molay and Baldwin and Godfrey de Bouillon and Bernard, but we also get Richard Coeur de Lion, right? Richard the Lionheart, Edward Longshanks, who is one of my direct ancestors, Edward III, the Black Prince, Frederick Barbarossa, Saladin. We get Genghis Khan, Tamerlane. There's so many huge figures that come out of this era. It says it concentrates on the period up to the Counter-Reformation, when they were monks with swords. However, let's see, the knight brethren of the military orders were noblemen vowed to poverty, chastity, and obedience, living a monastic life in convents, which were at the same time barracks, waging war on the enemies of the cross. In their chapels, one saw monks reciting the office, but outside they were soldiers in uniform. The three great orders were the Templars, Hospitallers, Knights of Malta, and Teutonic Knights. Though Santiago and Calatrava were no less formidable. Those are the Spanish orders, which are really cool. Most of them emerged during the 12th century to provide the church with stormtroopers for the Crusades. They were the first properly disciplined and officered troops in the West since Roman times. On many occasions, they tried literally to fight their way into heaven. During countless wars, they never doubted that theirs was a religious calling. Who fights us fights Jesus Christ, claimed the Teutonic Knights. For the Holy War was once an ideal admired by all Western Christians, and the crusade an inspiration which endured for centuries. The brethren fought and prayed in many lands and in many seas. As Edward Gibbon wrote in Crusader Palestine, the firmest bulwark of Jerusalem was founded on the Knights of the Hospital of St. John and of the Temple of Solomon, and on the strange association of a monastic and military life, which fanaticism might suggest, but which policy must approve. Because of their sacrifices, Outremer, that's the title of my video here, Outremer, which means essentially the land of the Crusades. This is an all-encompassing term for the four states. There were four Crusader states in the Middle East. This is a time when there was actually a king of Jerusalem, right? A Christian king of Jerusalem, the first Crusades. And it endured for nearly 2 centuries. After the kingdom of Jerusalem had finally fallen, the Hospitallers, first from Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. You guys ever get to go to the Greek Isles or go to the Aegean, go to the island of Rhodes or Patmos? Beautiful. And then from Malta, devoted themselves to guarding the shores of the Mediterranean and protecting Christian merchantmen against Turks and Barbary corsairs. Outremer also is it's the land across the sea, right? Across the Mediterranean. The soldier monks waged another holy war in Northern Europe against the pagans of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, where they played a vital role in shaping the destinies of Germany and Poland. All these countries were influenced by them racially, economically, and politically. Let's see. It was the Teutonic Knights who created Prussia by conquering the heathen Baltic race, who were the original Prussians, and by the most thorough colonization seen in the entire Middle Ages. Now, we're also going to see one thing that's interesting is, for all of the neo-pagans out there, I'm going to read some of the accounts of why the Crusaders and why the Teutonic Knights had such a problem with them, right? Because of what they were into and some of their rituals at the time. In Spain, the Brethren of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, spearheaded the Reconquista. Remember, the Reconquista, you'll know from school, from Spanish class or history class, that the Reconquista, that Spain was overtaken from 711 to 1492 until finally their expulsion under Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. Imagine your land being taken over for 700 years, right? So that is where these groups, in Spain, of course, they did have secret societies, more so than in Europe, because of the nature of the fight that they were in. And they had these holy orders, and that is why they were so formidable, because they had 700 years to practice warfare. Now, of course, that is sort of a, that now has become a global phenomenon that's, an everyday fact. Look at what's happening in that country over there in the East, in Eastern Europe right now, which is mentioned in this book in 1972, because it's a product of, we have the Rus, we have the Vikings, we have the Teutonic Knights fighting all the way to Kiev. And Kiev is what I call it. I don't give a fuck what they say. It's Kiev is what I say. Excuse my language, folks. I know it's a Saturday afternoon. And that is when we talk about like occupation or, essentially the garrison state, that now is just an everyday globalist phenomenon, right? Cheers to you guys. Yeah, former Ghost says, go to Patmos, the holy island of the apocalypse. Absolutely. It says they consolidated the Christian advance, ranching sheep and cattle on the lonely Meseta, where no peasant dared settle for fear of Moorish raiders. Speaking of Moorish raiders, maybe we should read Othello next, right? What's up, Hollywood Will Burn, my homie on Instagram. What's up, homeboy, based homeboy? Good to see you. Remember, Othello is Shakespeare's work about the Moor of Venice, right? It says, for Portugal, other brethren initiated the expansion of Europe with expeditions which were half missionary and half commercial. Henry the Navigator, master of the Knights of Christ, successors to the Portuguese Templars, presided over a research center at Sagres, where he employed the foremost geographers of the day, and from where he sent out ships on voyages of discovery under the order's flag. It's surprising that so few historical romances have been written about them. The Gotterdammerung-like fight to the death by the Templars and Hospitallers at the fall of Acre in 1291, Hochmeister Ulrich von Uningen, his refusal to leave the doomed field of Tannenberg, and the Knights of Malta, too badly wounded to stand waiting in chairs at the breach of Fort St. Elmo for the Turks' final assault, are only the best known among many scenes of epic heroism. The end of the Templars, whose last master, Jacques de Molay, was burned alive over a slow fire, has inspired the odd novel, but it needs an opera to do it justice. Of the other 21 masters of the temple, 5 died in battle, 5 of wounds, and 1 of starvation in a Saracen prison. It's hard to accuse these guys of what they were accused of later, when the fact is they, on record, by definition, fought and died. All these guys fought and died, and I don't mean just died. They were tortured to death for years, for decades. Right? They went to fight for the Holy Land. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Eisenstein made the Teutonic Knights defeat on the ice of Lake Peipus in 1242 the plot for his film Alexander Nevsky. There's also Henri de Montherlant's play Le Mat de Santiago, but little else. Whatever their order, the Knights' inspiration was the same on the banks of the Jordan or the Tagus, on the Mediterranean or the Baltic. They were as much a part of monasticism as the friars. If mendicant brethren preached the gospel. Military brethren defended it. Take this sword. Its brightness stands for faith. Its point for hope. Its guard for chastity. Use it well, says the hospitaller right of profession. The Bible may tell us that those who live by the sword shall perish by the sword, but the knights saw themselves as warriors of Christ. They do indeed deserve the title monks of war. And then we have a quote by Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Bernard. Such are they whom God chooses for himself and gathers from the furthest ends of the earth, servants from among the bravest in Israel to guard watchfully and faithfully his sepulchre and the temple of Solomon, sword in hand, ready for battle. Okay, so let's see. Beginning of the Templars. The three greatest military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, were founded in the 12th century. And an earlier Renaissance, which saw the birth of Gothic architecture, the zenith of papal monarchy, and an intellectual revolution that would culminate with Aquinas. Perhaps its most outstanding figure was the Cistercian monk Bernard of Clairvaux, last of the fathers of the Western Church. The Templars had been in existence for a decade when he met their founder, Hugh de Payen, in 1127. But this meeting was the real moment of the military brethren's genesis. For St. Bernard at once understood how Hughes's inspiration matched the conflicting vocations of chivalry and the cloister. The abbot of Clairvaux, Bernard, was the great moral force of his day, proclaimed the superiority of love to knowledge, and presided over the change in religious emotion when the humanity of Christ was at last fully appreciated. A crucifix of the 10th century has a figure of Christ the King in majesty, Christos Pantocrator, the terrible judge, while one of the 12 has a compassionate representation of the tortured man. It says, the ascetic impulse produced a papal revolution. Talks about Gregory the Seventh and the papacy and all that. And then let's see. When in 1095, Pope Urban II called upon the faithful to recover Jerusalem, page 24 in this book, occupied by the Muslims. He says Muslims is how he pronounces it in this book. So I'll just go with what he says because I'm just reading the text. Since 638, his appeal inspired extraordinary enthusiasm. Palestine's importance was heightened by the new appreciation of Christ's humanity. The scenes of the Passion were still pointed out at Jerusalem. That his city should belong to infidels was contrary to the law of God. Fortunately, the Muslim world was in chaos from India to Portugal. Syria was more vulnerable than it had been for a century, broken up into principalities ruled by Turkish atabegs, while the Fatimid Caliphate at Cairo was in terminal decline. The Crusaders stormed Jerusalem in July 1099. Those who stayed in Palestine were adventurers, mainly French, with nothing to go back to, and the state they created reflected the feudalism of their own land. It came to include 4 baronies. Okay, here are the 4 Crusader states. The Principality of Galilee, the County of Jaffa and Ascalon, and the Lordship of Carrick and Montreal, and the Lordship of Sidon, together with 12 smaller fiefs. There were also 3 lesser states, the Principality of Antioch and the counties of Tripoli and Edessa. Outremer was shaped like an hourglass, extending for nearly 500 miles from the Gulf of Aqaba on the Red Sea to Edessa, which lay east to the Euphrates. Then he talks about the Franks. There was a large native Christian population, Maronite, Melkite, Syrian, and Armenian. Let's see. Morphia, the queen of Baldwin II himself, was the daughter of an Armenian prince. That's a cool name, Morphia. Christianized Arabs. French was the language of administration, and the ruling classes remained French. And nevertheless, to the Franks, Jerusalem was home. So remember, we've covered a lot of the early history. We've covered the Vikings. We've covered the Northmen and their literature. We've done Beowulf. We've done the Angles, the Saxons, the Danes, the Utes. We haven't really covered Charlemagne because we haven't done so much historical literature. We've done Beowulf, the Seafarer, the Mariner, the Wanderer, etc. But it's interesting one thing to remember is that the vernacular language, just to, in terms of literature and the literary, thank you, Natesky, appreciate you, homeboy. The language of the vernacular was guided by first Latin, right? Remember the Romans took over Britain, Londinium, right? And the British Isles. We've covered Julius Caesar, and we've covered in the 12 Caesars when Julius Caesar, and Suetonius, and how Julius Caesar conquered the British Isles, etc., and remained that way for a long time. But then we had the overwhelming force of the Viking hordes, right? With the Angles, the Saxons, all coming essentially from Central Europe. I don't know what the anthropology is, but I think that they essentially come from Central Europe around Switzerland, right? With the Celts, the Franks, the Gauls, all these people came out of there, and they gave the first English, works in English, including the epic Beowulf, and we have the Venerable Bede writing about England as a nation, and then we have like Geoffrey of Monmouth and the history of the kings of Britain. But we have an English language which is Old English, which is essentially Germanic, right? So, English is not a. Forgive me if I'm covering this again, and you already know this. English is not a Romance language, right? The Romance languages. There are 5 Romance languages: Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Romanian, and they all come from Rome. They are Romance because they come from Rome. They are Romanesque. They're not romance like romantic, like love. They are Romance because they are Romanesque, and they are all derived from Latin. Now, our modern English language is derived from essentially 3 sources, right? Germanic, Latin, and Greek, with a hodgepodge of other languages now thrown into the vernacular and common language now. But the Old English, its origins are essentially Germanic and are the same. They're the same as Old German. It begins to diverge and evolve over time because of climate and people and distances and geography, all this stuff, and turns into Middle English, where we have Chaucer. Chaucer's the most well-known example with the Canterbury Tales. And of course, Chaucer is also tied into this history because Chaucer's Knight's Tale, right? Chaucer's knight is at one of the battles described in this work. And then we move on to modern English with the King James Bible and with Shakespeare in the early 17th century, right? And that's our language now. But most people don't know, most will not know this, that, English was not spoken at the court, right? It was not spoken by royalty or the nobles or in court until after the Crusades. I mean, Richard the Lionheart is Richard Coeur de Lion, right? Because he spoke French. Richard I didn't even speak English. Who knows if he spoke English in terms of his, vernacular, but in terms of what's written about him and his language at the court, he spoke French. French was the language of royalty for, a few hundred years. And that's why a lot of these place names and a lot of the names of the knights, they are literally French, but are in French. This says, let's see. So in 1115, Hugh de Payen arrives in Syria. In the year 1118, he becomes protector of the pilgrims and the pilgrim line from Europe to the Middle East. He has 7 knights, and he creates the Templars, the Knights of the Temple of Solomon, and he is subsidized by Baldwin I, the king of Jerusalem, and they get a castle, which they're centered at Al-Aqsa, the Temple of Solomon. So then it says on page 28, schism with Rome was not yet an accomplished fact, but the West had little understanding of Eastern Christendom. The Byzantine army was still extremely formidable, consisting almost entirely of mercenaries, English and Danish infantry, with Patzinak and Cuman cavalry. At this date, the Armenians were still fierce mountain warriors, though their old kingdom in Greater Armenia, the land of Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark rested, had been absorbed and their princes murdered by the Byzantines, so that they were unable to resist the Seljuk onslaught. Talks about what these guys wore. All of the orders wore essentially the same sort of uniform, a tunic, a cloak. Their militaria, their regalia sort of changed over the years, but all of the military orders had essentially the same cross. They had a similar cross and where the cross was placed on their cloak and on their armor. Of course, we know that the Templar cross is like the red cross on the white background. We get the like TGF mentioned, we get the cross of the Order of Hospitallers, and then the Knights of Malta, the 8-pointed cross. The Teutonic cross was a black cross on white with a gray background, and became the Iron Cross, of course, in the 20th century. And then they had various. There was a green cross. They had different versions in Spain, etc. What's up? What's up, Jerry? What's going on, homeboy? We're just talking about some medieval history here. It says, let's see. King Baldwin was impressed and gave the poor knights a wing of the royal palace, the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, thought to be the Temple of Solomon. He also joined the patriarch in subsidizing them. So that's the beginning of the Templars, how they are subsidized, right? Thank you, former ghost. I appreciate you. And it says, even before the Crusade, there was a hospital of St. John, the Almoner for pilgrims at Jerusalem near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the absolute holiest site to the Templars and the warrior monks. And they end up electing a certain frater, the brother. They're called, all the orders, they have brothers, Gerard, about whom little is known, and he was elected master. So this talks about the hierarchy of the Knights Templar, and how all of the other holy, the warrior monk orders will take on the same hierarchical system as the Templar. As the Templars, they establish it, and they are ruled over by Grand Master, and then they have various degrees below that. And it's interesting that the Grand Master is elected. He's elected through a complicated process that ensures anonymity, but he is elected. Somebody mentioned, when I put this up on Instagram, they said, I was surprised to know that the Doge of Venice is not even a Doge. Yeah, I know, it's interesting, right? The Doge of Venice, Doge comes from the Latin word dux, right? D-U-X, which also gave you the word Il Duce, right, with Mussolini. And it's essentially the leader, but he's neither a duke. Doge also sort of translates to duke, but he's neither like a hereditary or a true duke, nor a royal. He's an elected official. This says Hugh went and met with St. Bernard at the Abbey of Clairvaux. And the next year, Hugh de Payens himself came to ask Bernard for a new crusade. Because remember, the first crusade, which is the most successful crusade, is where they recaptured Jerusalem, and King Baldwin is the king of Jerusalem. Let's see. Copies of page 31 here, copies of the Templar Constitution survive from the 13th century. And these state that the first part of the rule was, translate from French, for the commandment of the order from the venerable Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard thought of Hughes's new brethren as military Cistercians. Significantly, brother knights wore a white hooded habit in the cloister like Cistercian choir monks, while lesser brethren wore brown, as did Cistercian lay brothers. On active service, this habit was replaced by a cloak, an emphasis on silence, even to the extent of using signs in the refectory. Refectory came from the same source, while the simplicity of Cistercian altar furnishings was paralleled by the plainest weapons and saddlery possible, with no trace of gold or silver. That's where we get the idea of the Masonic hand signs, right? Because of the vows of silence of the monks within the abbey or the cloisters and their various hand signs. It says he had to crop his hair and grow a beard, being forbidden to kiss even his mother or sister. For the first time in Christian history, soldiers would live as monks, and its ideals were set out in a pamphlet in praise of new knighthood, written to attract recruits. Now, of course, in England and in Western Europe, there's a natural similarity and attraction between the knights, the Grail legends and the knights of the Round Table, right, and the Templars. And even now, those two things can sort of be confused in terms of, your popular culture or popular consciousness of the history. However, it's okay to sometimes confuse these two things, because there is a similarity. I mean, they're both Christian orders of warrior monks. And we need to do Les Morts d'Arthur and Parsifal. We should do Parsifal next. Actually, Parsifal, it was adapted, of course, by Wagner for the Ring Cycle and was made into the opera Parsifal. But Wolfram von Eschenbach was again another of these figures who was in the periphery of this and who was there at the time, who witnessed some of these battles, and he was inspired by this to write his poem, his epic poem Parsifal. Circles within circles. We have the hierarchy is established on page 34. The seneschal, the marshal, the commander. There's a commander of the city of Jerusalem. There's a draper, and synchro. It even talks about a procedure which recalled the election of the Venetian Doge. Yeah, okay, I just mentioned that one. And then there's auxiliary brethren. And one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that how can we compare these guys to now? What's our nearest equivalent? Well, in terms of art and media, I would say that it's obvious that George Lucas based the Jedi on the Templars, right? I guess that's obvious to everybody. Is that a hot take or is that obvious to everybody? I don't know. The order's ecclesiastical privileges were very great. I know that's kind of a lame thing to say, and it's kind of, it's downplaying the importance, the significance of the Templars, with this fictional thing. But I guess in terms of something to compare them to, in terms of something that everyone recognizes. The order's ecclesiastical privileges were very great, since though it soon acquired its own clergy, priest brothers, it was exempt from episcopal visitations, being responsible to the Pope alone. The bull Omne Datum Optimum allowed these chaplains to celebrate Mass and dispense the sacraments during an interdict. As clerics, brethren could be tried only in ecclesiastical courts. It has been said that they were both a church within a church and a state within a state. Right? Here we get the deep state. The deep state established by the Templars with the incorporation of international banking, literal international banking, right, which then is absorbed into the European feudal system later, and then also literal corporations, right, because the Templars sort of existed in one way as a corporation. They were responsible for the mercantile system and for trade, and they were a powerful corporation. It says, the new brethren had joined the order not just to fight, but to pray. They saw nothing contradictory in their vocation. In St. Bernard's words, killing for Christ was malicide, not homicide, the extermination of injustice rather than of the unjust, and therefore desirable. Indeed, to kill a pagan, to quote, to kill a pagan is to win glory, since it gives glory to Christ. Long before the Crusades, Popes Leo IV and John VIII had declared that warriors pure in heart who died fighting for the church would inherit the kingdom of God. Death in battle was martyrdom, a road traveled by 20,000 Templars during the next 2 centuries. 20,000 Templars, right? That is a huge force. And a lot of times, especially in the wars in the Baltic and in Spain, etc., you'll have actual, national military forces, but you'll have a core group of essentially 500 shock troops that are the warrior monks, and they work as both like sort of Green Beret-esque advisors to the king and to the military hierarchy, and also as specifically as shock troops. One thing that's brought out in this is that is the idea of the knight, the medieval knight, and remember that the knight you could become a knight from any social class, from any social strata. But they're sometimes misunderstood because of, the emphasis on the heraldic tales, especially in British literature. What they were was, again, they were extremely formidable. They carried all of their wealth on them. Yes, a lot of these knights would go back to their landed, to their land where they existed within the feudal system. But when they were in the Crusades, this is where they all went. They all went to the Crusades. Edward I went there. Henry II, Henry VI, even John Smith, much later, sort of way post-Crusades, John Smith I don't think I'm mistaken in this. I think John Smith, of like Virginia and Pocahontas, his coat of arms has 3 heads on it because he was said to have decapitated 3 Saracens at once in a battle in the Spanish Crusade. So these guys, they rode on a palfrey, and then they had a war horse. Their war horse was trained to kick, to bite. They were gigantic horses. They were like tanks. All of their armor they wore all of their armor. They wore chainmail. Of course, the warrior monks would often wear hair shirts of hair, right? Because of their holy vows. But these guys were they were huge, and they required a lot of people to keep them in business, so to speak. They terrified the Saracens. Saladin himself, in his own, you can still read it. Saladin respected the Templars. They feared the Templars. Now, that doesn't mean that he was afraid of them. It means that he feared them as a eyeball to eyeball, worthy fucking adversary, man, right? And and they terrified the enemy. Let's see. I'm going to let's get to the assassins on page 49. Let's talk about the assassins. So the assassins, people will be interested in this. The assassins are known because the origin of the word assassin, of course, is Hashishin. And some scholars will maintain that that's inaccurate or incorrect, and it's all down to Marco Polo's account of the assassins. I just happen to have Marco Polo's account right here, so we're going to read that from his travels. And but what we think of the assassins is that they were I think they were a Shia sect. And forgive me if I'm wrong, but they were essentially what Marco Polo says. Before I read the account, what he said was that they were under the control. They were started by a guy, and then they were under the control of this guy Hassan, and they were named so because they were drugged. They would eat hashish, probably hashish, opium, etc. I mean, opium's been around in the West since Alexander the Great, conquered India, etc., and spread it throughout Egypt, and so that had been around. And they were essentially drugged. And they believed that they would, if they died for their faith, that they would go to this sort of earthly paradise, and that they were these drugged zealots. And they certainly were, in a way, what we think of now as the common, assassin. They killed singularly. They had a number of, poisoned arrows, poisoned blades, poisoned daggers. They killed a number. They tried to assassinate Edward I. Longshanks. They killed a number of famous people, starting with Muslims, and they had their own castle where they were ruled over by Hassan, the man of the mountain, right? The old man of the mountain. So here's what Marco Polo says about the assassins. He says, Mulahet, which means heretics, according to the law of the Saracens, is the country where the sheikh of the mountain, the old man of the mountain, used to live in days gone by. This is page 70 of his travels. I will tell you his story just as I, Marco, have heard it told by many people. The sheikh was called in their language Aladdin, I guess. He had made in a valley between 2 mountains the biggest and most beautiful garden that ever was seen, planted with all the finest fruits in the world, and containing the most splendid mansions and palaces that were ever seen, ornamented with gold and with the likeness of all that is beautiful on earth, and also 4 conduits, one flowing with wine, one with milk, one with honey, and one with water. This, obviously, you can see the how this was mirrored in Coleridge's Kubla Khan, which we've talked about, right? Weave a circle around him thrice. Caverns made of ice, right? There were fair ladies there and damsels, the loveliest in the world, unrivaled at playing every sort of instrument and at singing and dancing. And he gave his men to understand that this garden was paradise, capital P. That is why he had made it after this pattern, because Muhammad assured the Saracens that those who go to paradise will have beautiful women to their heart's content to do their bidding, and will find there rivers of wine and milk and honey and water. So he'd had this garden made like the paradise that Muhammad promised to the Saracens, and the Saracens of this country believed that it was paradise. No one ever entered the garden except those whom he wished to make assassins. Here we get this word, right? At the entrance stood a castle so strong that it need fear no man in the world, and there was no other way in except through the castle. Remember that I think there is an example of the word assassin prior to Shakespeare in print, but Shakespeare essentially, I'm going to go ahead and say Shakespeare coins the word assassin. And where does that occur? It occurs in Macbeth, which we've covered. That was our very first stream here. Are you an assassin? You're an errand boy sent by grocery clerks to collect the bill. That's Apocalypse Now. The first time that I heard the word assassin, by the way, not that I heard the word assassin, but that I associated it with the Hashishin, with this group. I learned it when I was 16, I think, and I read Rimbaud's Illuminations. So we're going to get to that in a second from one of his poems. The Sheikh kept with him at his court all the youths of the country from 12 years old to 20, all that is who shaped well as men in arms. These youths knew well by hearsay that Muhammad, their prophet, had declared paradise to be made of such a fashion as I've described, and so they accepted it as truth. Now mark what follows. He used to put some of these youths in his paradise 4 at a time, or 10 or 20, according as he wished. And this is how he did it. He would give them drafts that sent them to sleep on the spot. That sounds like opium. Then he had them taken and put in the garden where they were wakened. When they awoke and found themselves in there and saw all the things I've told you of, they believed they were really in paradise. And the ladies and damsels stayed with them all the time, singing and making music for their delight and ministering to all their desires. So these youths had all they could wish for and asked nothing better than to remain there. Now the Sheikh held his court with great splendor and magnificence and bore himself most nobly and convinced the simple mountain folk round about that he was a prophet. And they believed it to be the truth. And when he wanted emissaries to send on some mission of murder, he would administer the drug to as many as he pleased. And while they slept, he had them carried into his palace. He's an opium warlord. He's an old man of the mountain is an opium warlord cult leader, right? When these youths awoke and found themselves in the castle within the palace, they were amazed and by no means glad, for the paradise from which they had come was not a place that they would ever willingly have left. They went forthwith to the Sheikh and humbled themselves before him as men who believed that he was a great prophet. When he asked them from whence they came, they would answer that they came from paradise, and that this was in truth the paradise of which Muhammad had told their ancestors. And they would tell their listeners all that they had found there. And the others who heard this and had not been there were filled with a great longing to go to this paradise. They longed for death so that they might go there and look forward eagerly to the day of their going. The Sheikh would make a great feast in their honor. He knew very well which of them had displayed the greatest zeal, because after each he had sent others of his men as spies to report which was the most daring and the best hand at murdering. Then, in other hand, to bring about the death of the Lord or other man which he desired, he would take some of these assassins of his and send them whenever he might wish, telling them that he was minded to dispatch them to paradise. They were to go accordingly and kill such and such a man. If they died on their mission, they would go there all the sooner. Those who received such a command obeyed it with a right good will, more readily than anything else they might have been called on to do. Away they went and did all that they were commanded. Thus it happened that no one ever escaped when the Sheikh of the mountains, old man of the mountain, desired his death. And I can assure you that many kings and many lords paid tribute to him and cultivated his friendship for fear that he might bring about their death. This happened because at the time the nations were not united in their allegiance, but torn by conflicting loyalties and purpose. So that's the old man of the mountain, and that's the assassins. That's the root of the assassins. In this book, it says on page 49, in 1173, the new Maccabees, as the English Pope Adrian IV called the Templars, he called them the new Maccabees, had a fierce quarrel with the king over the assassins. The Hashishin, eaters of hashish, were an extremist sect of the Shias. Yeah, Shia, I was right. Whose founder had placed an excessive emphasis on the doctrine of jihad. That paradise was the reward for death in combat against unbelievers. Their weapon was the poison knife. Flat cakes their trademark, and they terrorized Muslims and Christians alike. The sect's organization had a superficial resemblance to the Brethren's. They had several eagles' nests in the mountains of the Lebanon, whose governor was called the Sheikh al-Gabel, the old man of the mountains. In 1173, this was Rashid ad-Din Sinan, who was much alarmed by the recent extinction of the Fatimid Caliphate. Suddenly, he sent an embassy to King Amalric announcing his imminent conversion to Christianity and asking to be relieved of this tribute imposed by the Templars. The king knew just how much belief to place in his conversion, but peace in the Nosari and the use of the assassin intelligence network were worth having. He remitted the tribute, announcing that his own ambassadors would visit the Sheikh. As the assassin envoys were returning home, they were ambushed by the Templars under the one-eyed Frater Gautier de Mesnil and decapitated. Amalric was so furious that to his orders, he appeared to be out of his senses. They also tried to kill Saladin. They did not like Saladin. Saladin now ruled Damascus as well as Cairo and was proclaimed king of Egypt and Syria in 1176 with the Caliph of Baghdad's official blessing. A Kurdish adventurer who hacked his way to the throne. Once there, he became a Muslim St. Louis, something of a mystic, an ascetic who fasted, slept on a rough mat, and gave alms unceasingly. His ambition was to restore the unity of Sunni Islam, which would include a jihad against the Franks. Nevertheless, with his sensitive, inquiring mind, he saw that there was much good in Christianity, even if it lacked the so-called third revelation, was intrigued by the Frankish code of chivalry. The Franks had a deep respect for his bravery and magnanimity. There was even a legend that in his youth he had been knighted by the constable of Jerusalem. Amalric died in the same year, succeeded by perhaps the most gallant figure of the whole Frankish venture, the leper king, Baldwin IV, who was king of Jerusalem, 1174 to 1185. If you've seen Kingdom of Heaven, the Ridley Scott movie, that's what that's about. Now, Saladin lasted a long time, and he's one of the great, historical figures, one of the great warlords of history, because he united their whole side against the crusade, an anti-crusade, and great as in important, right? Later on at the trial of the Templars, one of the things that they will bring to bear on Jacques de Molay is they'll say, well, even Saladin said that you guys were perverts and creepers, and that's why the Crusades fell apart. And Jacques de Molay is like, well, I've never heard that, and I know everything about Saladin, and I was there, and why are you going to take the testimony of this guy who was there to destroy the holy sites of the Holy Land, and who also ruled over a bunch of perverts and creepers, right? So I found that pretty interesting. It says it goes through goes through Saladin, and Saladin ended up fighting against Richard I. Richard I and Saladin became mortal enemies, but who respected one another. And that's in a great book called Warriors of God, which is another book about this the latter part of this era. It says the Templars actually routed Saladin and killed a bunch of his troops, and Saladin escaped. It was a bloodbath. Saladin and his troops fled into the Sinai Desert, where they all but perished. The Templars are a couple of things that also come out of the Templars. We've talked about the intelligence networks of Europe, right? And Jay has done this, of course, extensively, right? Talked about the intelligence networks and the origins in the, especially with Francis Walsingham and the Elizabethan era and the spy network. I mean, just the other day mentioned, that famous portrait of Elizabeth I with the peacock eyes, because it represents the eyes she had throughout the kingdom. One of the things that I think is interesting is that itself is inherited from the Templars, because the Templars established really what you would call a proto spy network that was massive. The Templars, one of the things that they were good at, they were there to reconquer the Holy Land, keep the holy sites safe, protect the pilgrims in their line to the Holy Land, to establish a banking system. The hospitallers set up the hospitals. They had a trade network, but also they had an intelligence network. And of course, with this network of hundreds of priories and castles all throughout the Holy Land, the Middle East, and all of Europe, extending all the way into the British Isles and Ireland, the Templars had a massive spy network. And of course, that's one of the things that European royalty relied on. The assassins on the other side had their own spy network, which itself was massive. These were armed intelligence figures. This is like the Directorate of Operations, but in 1,000 years ago, right? It says, and another thing, when the Templars were captured in battle, they could expect no quarter. They gave no quarter, and they could expect no quarter, and that's why so many of them died, because they apparently in the written accounts, they would be tortured to death, but not give up any. Who knows if they gave up any information? But they certainly were willing to die. They would not be ransomed. And the practice at the time, of course, was if you're somebody and you're caught in battle, you would be ransomed for a huge amount of money. But the Templars always resisted the ransom. It talks about William of Tyre, and let's see. Then we get Renaud de Chatillon on page 52. So the Templars did have their bad guys. They did have their bad figures. It's a huge organization, so of course they had renegades and bad guys, and that is one of the things that foreshadows their end, because they did alienate the population in a number of places for a number of times because they had so much wealth, right? And they had some bad guys, including Renaud de Chatillon, who was the lord of the Outre-Jourdain, and he was an archetypal robber baron, a murderous throwback to the northern progenitors of the French aristocracy. His most lunatic exploit took place in 1182 when he transported ships piece by piece over the desert to the Red Sea and raided the pilgrims on their way to Mecca, earning the Franks the hatred of the whole Muslim world. It's kind of Lawrence of Arabia beforehand, right? Insanely brave and totally unscrupulous. He had much in common with Frater Gerard. Outremer's affairs were exposed to the meddling of two irresponsible berserks at a time when the kingdom desperately needed wise and cautious leadership. Okay, because Baldwin IV had to keep him under control. And it said, God always gave the victory to Christians unless they displeased him, just as he had done with the people of Israel. On page 53, it says. At one of their battles, the Templars would carry the true cross in the avant-garde during the battle. And it says the Muslims captured the true cross and its gold reliquary. Renaud de Chatillon, the harrier of pilgrims, was struck down by Saladin himself. At his express orders, every Templar and Hospitaller was beheaded. He had them killed, explains the Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, because they were the fiercest of all the Frankish warriors. And then finally, the Templars had lost Jerusalem. They lose it to Saladin. And the Templars astonished the Muslims by standing motionless and silent in the breach when they were being besieged at a castle. These campaigns deflected Saladin from the reduction of Tyre, the center of Christian resistance. So Tyre becomes the center of the Crusader world. When Richard I comes, Richard I arrives, and Saladin asks the Templars for their word that the prisoners that Richard caught would not be harmed, but knowing Richard's brutal, unreliable temperament, they refused it. On August 20th, Richard ordered his English troops to butcher nearly 3,000 men, women, and children. 2 days later, he marched on Ascalon down the coast road with the sea covering one flank, the Hospitallers for his advance guard, and the Templars covering his rear. This is where Richard almost recaptures Jerusalem. But instead, he decides to refortify Jaffa because it's almost a Hotler situation with going. People will criticize during that war in the 20th century when Hotler was close to Moscow and was going to capture it, and instead divided his troops, and that led to Stalingrad. But the reason people don't often understand that is because he wanted to go capture the Pulaski oil fields, right? He needed to capture the oil fields in order to run the mechanization, the mechanized military system, right? And sort of the same thing happens with Richard when he goes to take Jerusalem. He can take Jerusalem, but he can't keep it. So instead, he goes and he veers off and he fortifies Jaffa down the coast. And anyway, that Jerusalem is never retaken during the Crusades. Shouts out to Ellie out there because Richard on his way to on his way to the Middle East stops at Cyprus, and he loves Cyprus so much that he decides to take it. He just captures Cyprus. Then he sells Cyprus to the Templars. And it says they soon upset the islanders by their arrogant administration. In April 1192, there was a fierce uprising in the Templar commander. 14 brethren and 100 troops survived only by taking refuge in the citadel of Nicosia. A few days later, they launched a lethal counterattack, which was successful, but the Templars returned the island to Richard. He sold it to Guy, who borrowed the necessary down payment from the merchants of Tripoli, then left the Holy Land forever. Cyprus is like continuously being retaken and taken and sold off to various people. I mean, Henry the Second, I think, is, Cyprus is included in his domains, in his dominion, and then Henry the Sixth ends up going there. Of course, it's useful because it's a stop on the way to the whole. If you're taking the sea voyage across the Mediterranean, it's a stop on the way, right off the coast. But it's interesting that that there's still, apparently, you'd have to ask Ellie, but there's still all this architecture of the Templar castles and of the medieval era. It says. The temple on page 59, the Temple of Solomon and the hospital were lost with Jerusalem, so the brethren moved their chief houses to Acre. Then it says, let's see, Amalric, his sole achievement was to found the third great military order, the Teutonic Knights, in 1198. So here we have the Teutonic Knights. And let's see, I'm going to skip to Genghis Khan. Here's where Genghis Khan comes in. Page 7. It's so funny to me that I just think this is. I don't know about you guys. This just blows my mind. It's like you've got this conflagration. You got so many people fighting, and then all of a sudden, this third party comes out of nowhere, right? And it's Genghis Khan. It says, let's see. The word knight has a certain fairy tale flavor, which obscure. Oh, I have to cover this in the beginning. Which obscures the fact that such a man was a specialized fighting machine. They were often employed by the baronial household in administrative as well as military posts, or they applied for hire as mercenaries. The Franks could afford to indulge in such petty squabbles as the War of St. Sabas only because their Muslim enemies were distracted by the threat of Mongol invasion. At the end of the 12th century, the nomadic tribes of the Gobi Desert had united under Genghis Khan, and the standard of the 9 yak tails had swept like a roaring whirlwind through Asia. Quote, the scourge of heaven's fury in the hands of the merciless Tartars. The scourge of God is often Attila the Hun is often given that name. But before that, it's Genghis Khan, which is essentially to say in the minds of the writers of the time that what it means is like these people are causing so much destruction that God sends a scourge, a whip in the form of Genghis Khan to destroy, is what they said. Says the legend of Prester John, the great Christian potentate of the East, probably arising from the rumors of the Coptic kings of Ethiopia, was well known in Latin Syria and resulted in much wishful thinking about the great Khan. King Louis had sent ambassadors to Karakorum, while the king of Armenia went in person acknowledging Manga as overlord in return for military assistance. And it says, on March 1st, 3 Christian princes, Kitpuka, Hathum of Armenia, and Bohemond VI of Antioch, rode triumphantly into Damascus. At Baghdad, Hulagu had shown special favor to the Nestorian Catholics, and they were equally kind to the Christians in the new city, but by now no great Muslim power existed east of Egypt. The Tartars were uncomfortable neighbors who tolerated only vassals, not independent allies, and the Poulains preferred civilized infidels to barbarous Christians, it says. However, Hochmeister Anno von Sengrenhausen warned them that the Saracens would turn on the Franks if they were victorious. Outremer remained neutral. Kitbuka was surrounded, his troops wiped out, and he himself captured and beheaded. Turkish captains playing polo with his head. Next, the Sultan, the same crossbowman who had defeated St. Louis, was a soldier of genius, even if, in the words of a French historian, he was also a treacherous and ferocious beast of prey. This former slave soon controlled all Saladin's former empire, because Saladin dies, which gave the armies of the Mamluk sultans a mobility unknown to their predecessors. Determined both to annihilate Franks and Armenians, Baybars, that's the name of the sultan, launched his first sledgehammer blow in 1265. Let's see. He gives the knights safe conduct to the coast. The knights accepted and opened the castle gates, whereupon the sultan offered them a choice of Islam or death. Next morning, when they were paraded outside the walls to give their answer, the Castellan stepped forward, begging his brethren not to apostatize. The sultan had him skinned alive and the brethren decapitated, after which he decorated his new possession with their rotting heads. They're taking this town, and the canonesses of St. John, the women, the men had cut off their own noses with scissors and gashed their cheek. Oh no, the women had cut off their own noses with scissors and gashed their cheeks in order to avoid RAPE. He even, this sultan even horrified his own people. Says he never destroyed the hiding place of error without giving it to the flames and drenching it in blood. He went on to describe the desolation he had committed, the butchery of Antiochene priests and citizens, the desecration of churches, and how cheaply ladies had been sold in the slave market. And he's called a bone stuck in the let's see. They built this Templar castle called Crac de Chevalier, which is still there. The ruins are still there. And it's called a bone stuck in the throat of the Muslims. And then, let's see. And then Edward I arrives from England in May, but with fewer than 1,000 men, just to ply his trade, right? And to contribute to taking back this place, which had been conquered by these demons. Says... the assassins even paid Edward the compliment of trying to get him. The legendary occasion when the prince's young wife was supposed to have sucked the poison from the stab wound. Edward profited from his experience in the Middle East. It taught him how to conquer Wales. He later employed Syrian methods, sea-to-land assaults, sea lines of communication, and advances consolidated by castle administration points, whose small garrisons could be switched quickly from place to place along the coast. One of the things that I recognized reading this book was that the nature of war and what it represents really never changes in terms of like its purpose, in that this is what we see with Vietnam, right? And the Phoenix program is that there's this far off place, right? There's this sort of proxy war and this far off place. And the powers that be will use that as a military exercise operation to go and, apply their trade, to practice, and essentially a live fire practice, right? And this will harden their troops. But the aim of it is to learn from the war games, the live war games, and to put into place psychological operations, actual operations, black operations, and, literal war crimes, which are then covered up by propaganda and various things and the so-called fog of war. But the purpose is to take those things and bring them back into one's own country, right? I think that, my probably a hot take here, but my hypothesis is that that is exactly it's not the reason for what's happening now in Eastern Europe. The thing that's happening with the CIA and the various, military outfits, but it is certainly one of the major factors, right? It allows things to take place in a sort of a live military war game, which will then be used, lessons learned, to bring back to the United States. I mean, I know we all know that, right? But I think that it's weird that other people cannot see this. That's the continuous thing, right? That was the war on terror. That was the part of the proxy wars of the Cold War, right? That's what happened in the Crusades. Now, that's not to say that's not the raison d'etre. That's not the reason that they occurred. And certainly the Crusades itself had a reason, right, to go and conquer and take back the Holy Land, right? But I think that is one of the major factors that for these things, especially in terms of just the pure military operations. So it says, let's see, we get Henry II goes there. Okay, I'm going to skip forward to the Teutonic Knights, because what I wrote was on page 100 and 101, my little note I wrote was Teutonic Knights and the Sword Brethren, which is kind of a circle within a circle, fight the pagans in the Holy War of the Northern Crusade in the, quote, weird glitter of the Aurora, where the Saracens practice human sacrifice. So that's their northern border. The Teutonic Knights were, given legitimacy, and they mounted guard in the Holy Sepulchre. They had a castle at Starkenburg, and they took the Templars' rule and the Templars' habits and their hierarchy as their own. But they took their own system and took it to the northern borders of Europe to conquer the pagans. And these pagans, it says, the Balts worshipped idols in sacred groves and fields and attributed divine powers to the entire creature world, including their own animals. We know this. They practiced human sacrifice by burning or beheading and buried animals alive at funerals. Dead warriors were cremated astride their horses, while widows were often made to hang themselves. Stockades of towns and temples were adorned with animal skulls to ward off the evil eye. Their grim shrines served by weird priests and soothsayers. The Prussians' domestic habits were as unpleasant as their religion. The old, the sick, the blind, and the lame were invariably slaughtered. Drunkenness from mead and fermented mare's milk was a major pastime, while tribesmen often drank the living blood from their horses' veins. So that's what the Mongols did to survive, the drinking the horse blood. Intertribal warfare was endemic. Hermann decided that Prussia would make a good training ground for the wars in Outremer. There you go. That's vindication right there, right? They decided that Prussia would make a good training ground for the wars in Outremer. White-robed horsemen attacked. These are the Teutonic Knights. White-robed horsemen attacked them even in the snow, and riding over frozen rivers or charging out of blizzards like winter ghosts. Their great cloaks served for camouflage. Often under the weird glitter of the northern lights, combat was joined upon the ice that covered the rivers and marshes until the solid crust broke beneath the weight of the warriors, and the men of both sides were engulfed to their chilly doom. Prussians who submitted and accepted Christianity were left in possession of their lands and were enlisted as auxiliary troops. Prussians were, on page 102, were aggressively barbarous, and their land of swamps and forests held no sacred associations. Extremely treacherous, the tribesmen were expert at ambushes, and their ways with prisoners did not endear them. The Order's chronicles described the fate of two knights. One was placed in a cleft tree trunk held apart by ropes, which were released, crushing the wretched brother, whereupon the tree was set on fire. The other knight was lashed to his horse, mount and man being hauled to the top of an oak, underneath which a great fire was lit. The usual practice was to roast captured brethren alive in their armor like chestnuts before the shrine of a local god. No wonder they wanted to get rid of them, right? No wonder the Teutonic Knights wanted to get rid of these people. These people got to go. They got to go, right? These heathens. And the tree of death has popped up so many times recently, right? It popped up in the Northman, right? Where he sees that vision of the tree. It's the Yggdrasil, the world tree, right? And he sees all the generations in it. But it represents this kind of, I don't know, it's also kind of this Sephiroth, I guess. But it's like this tree of death where, combined with the nature worship of these pagans, and they devise these horrible methods of torture. Later on, it says, the Christians broke before the whirlwind onslaught of the 9 yak tails, fighting the Genghis Khan, and were annihilated. The brethren dying almost to a man. This one guy, the master, managed to escape. The Duke's head was impaled on a lance, while 9 sacks of severed ears were taken to Batu. The fugitives believed that they had been defeated by witchcraft. The yak banner was a demon with a devil face and a long gray beard. Well, they were demons. They're literally worshiping demons, right? And the sack of ears is directly that occurs directly again with Colonel Tony Poe and the Phoenix program, right? And the Ears for Beers program and the LERPs. It says there was little on page 104. There was little love between the Orthodox Christians of Rus and Catholic Teutons. Novgorod was ruled by Prince Alexander Nevsky after his victory on the river Neva in 1240 when he had defeated the Swedes. Eisenstein's film Alexander Nevsky caricatures the scene, but does at least provide some idea of the dread which the brethren inspired among Balts and Slavs. Their huge horses, faceless helmets, black cross shields, and billowing white cloaks gave them a truly nightmarish appearance. The ice slaughter put an end to Teutonic hopes of expansion into Russia beyond the Narva. Let's see, page 107. They mentioned Joshua, and it says, no doubt the knights found justification in the Old Testament. So Joshua smote all the country of the hills in the south and of the vale and of the springs and all their kings. He left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed as the Lord God commanded. And Joshua smote them from Kadesh, Barnea, even unto Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even unto Gibeon. And all these kings in their land did Joshua take at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. So they found inspiration in the Old Testament. The Black Cross was the sole blazonry permitted. And later on, that is taken by the SS, right, who takes that as their own blazonry. Says, okay, on page 109, we have the beginnings of the end of the Templars, because it says, in 1308, the Archbishop of Riga hoped to regain control of the city, asked Pope Clement V to suppress the Teutonic order because of its luxury, cruelty, and injustice. Accusations of sodomy and witchcraft followed. Now, they didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but this will give them later on ammunition. Let's see. Then I'm skipping forward here into, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the orders in Spain. The basic organization of the Knights of Calatrava was complete within 20 years. This is during the sort of the Spanish Crusades. And I wrote, it's important to remember the significance of the warrior brotherhood who arose out of necessity to defend against the infidel horde. And the 7 obligations of a Christian, according to the order, are comer, beber, to feed, to give drink to shoe, to clothe, to visit, to console the sick, the poor, and the afflicted, and to bury the dead. Later on page 182, I thought I would bring up this guy. Yeah, the Reconquista. There's this guy, Villena. Villena was a master of the temple in Spain. And let's see, it says, he is the supreme example of an intellectual master. His interests, including literature, alchemy, medicine, and gastronomy. Popular tradition also credits him with practicing black magic. Okay, again, we have foreshadowing of the end of the Templars here. He made the first translation of the Aeneid into a vernacular language and the first Castilian translation of Dante. We've covered Dante here. He also wrote on verse form, astrology, leprosy, and the evil eye, and compiled the first Spanish cookery book, the Arte Caesoria. So bizarre are the latter's recipes that some historians believe they hastened his early demise. If his writings are pompous, his interests eccentric and superstitious, Villena was nevertheless one of Spain's earliest humanists. And then it talks about this guy, the guy who supplanted him, Luis de Guzman himself, commissioned a Spanish translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, now known as the Alba Bible, from this guy, from a rabbi. And it says it was a triumph of the illuminator's art. The frontispiece shows the master seated on his throne, holding the order's sword and wearing a gray tunic and a great white cloak with a red cross, while below him his brethren in gray, red cross, but without cloaks, are depicted fulfilling the 7 duties of a Christian. This rabbi had toiled at his task for 10 years in the commandery of Maqueda. Like all grandees, each master kept, quote, his JEW, who combined the roles of financial advisor, land agent, accountant, and even tutor. Crazy. And then it talks about the Portuguese and their orders and Henry the Navigator. Let's see. I'm going to skip to the trial of the Templars and what happens at the end. Okay, so what do you guys think? We've been going here for a minute. We're in the last section of this book. We're going to talk about the trial of the Templars and how the Templars were destroyed in the end, and whether there's any truth to the accusations, or whether it resists the usual dialectic, right? The false dialectic, usually, right? Which is they were either this or that. Well, maybe they were a combination of both. And in fact, maybe they were a combination of both and they had some bad characters, but overall they were good, maybe. Again, my thesis is that the Templars existed for all the aforementioned reasons, and to reconquer literally reconquer the Holy Land from the infidel, right? And to take back these sites that had been desecrated. And they probably included, as part of their rituals and their initiation, many Gnostic elements, but those were also later taken and confused by the accusers for being strictly Cathars, right? And that the accusers were the ones who were truly practicing the witchcraft, occult rituals that they then accused the Templars of doing. Now, I don't know. I just think that that's what my reading tells me. That's what that's sort of the evidence that I find in the text. I just find it extremely problematic that, one thing that a lot of people will say is that, oh, they were certainly doing witchcraft and they were practicing all this, stuff, and they were worshiping the Baphomet, when they admitted to those things under duress, extreme torture, later recanted it, died for recanting it, were put to death, saying that they hadn't told the truth and this is the truth. And then the other element is that most people forget is that the guy who was the central accuser of the Templars, and he was responsible, the Chancellor, Philip IV Chancellor, was an Albigensian whose family had been put to death for heresy, and who knew these things intimately. He knew these rituals intimately, and I suspect that he himself was probably practicing these things and used them, his firsthand knowledge, as motivation in order to supplant the Templars, create a massive coup that just completely destroyed their organization and then absorbed it into new military orders, is what I think. It says on page 208, says, even during the days of Saint Bernard and Hugh de Payen, there had been criticism of the Templars. At the end of the 12th century, a German, Otto of Blasien, accused both Templars and Hospitallers of having reached a secret understanding with the Moslems, and as time went by, criticism of all military orders became widespread. Towards 1250, the English chronicler Matthew Paris wrote that the Templars and Hospitallers received such enormous revenues merely for defending the Holy Land that they were in danger of being dragged down to hell. He also alleged that they deliberately discouraged fresh crusades, which, if successful, might put them out of a job. In 1258, the Teutonic Knights were accused of trying to prevent the conversion of Prussians, or else of enslaving those who had converted, charges which almost certainly emanated from their hostile Polish neighbors. In other words, right, it's like snitches, right? During the 1260s, the Franciscan Roger Bacon argued that the same order's aggressive attitude impeded the preaching of the gospel. a charge which would also be made against the Templars by Archdeacon Walter Map in 1289. None of these attacks appears to have done the military orders any harm. They were far too much a part of the establishment of the Roman Church. But then, for many years, there had been strange rumors about the Templars who had developed a mania for secrecy. Minds darkened by hostility were only too ready to credit sinister accusations. Suspicions among thoughts are like bats among birds. They never fly by twilight. And the brethren became enveloped in a miasma of poisonous gossip. Let's see, Jacques de Molay. Jacques de Molay, who's probably the most famous Templar. I mean, that's who we think of because was the Grand Master when they were destroyed. Jacques de Molay was godfather to Philip IV's son. Interesting. And though in 1287, Philip had declared forfeit all Templar property acquired since 1258, he did not implement the decision. They supported him against Pope Boniface VIII, confirming a secret treaty for alliance in 1303, while in 1306, the king took refuge for 3 days in the Paris temple to escape a furious mob. So a furious mob comes after Philip IV, right? And where does he hide? Who does he seek to protect him? Right? Well, he seeks the Templars who take him in and protect him. Now, the mistake was that they took him and they hid him they gave him sanctuary, and that the sanctuary was also the royal treasury. Perhaps Philip's enforced sojourn aroused his cupidity. He had already organized a vicious pogrom against the JEWS, seizing their property, besides extracting forced loans from the Lombards. Indeed, he had good reason to appreciate the brethren's wealth, having borrowed large sums on special terms, including a dowry for his daughter Isabella, the she-wolf, when she married the future Edward II. That's interesting because Isabella, if you remember, Isabella, the she-wolf mentioned here, is the wife of Edward II. You guys remember the popular interpretation of Isabella? She is played by Sophie Marceau in Braveheart. Remember? She's the one that falls in love with Braveheart. Oh, he is so wonderful. I know that's a German accent. No. Oh, he is so handsome. He is very handsome. He is 7 feet tall, or whatever she says in the movie, right? But she goes after Edward II, who you remember what happens in Braveheart? Yes. Tell me, what do you think of that? And he throws the guy out the window. His creeper, fake and gay lover. The trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots. Anyway, that's the she-wolf they're talking about, right? So yeah, she's the daughter of Philip IV of France. And it says the Paris temple constituted something like a European money market. Preceptories were the safest banks available, and credit rates compared favorably with those of the JEWS or Lombards. Templar bills of exchange being accepted everywhere. It seems that the brethren preferred money to landed property. In about 1250, Matthew Paris estimated the Hospitallers' wealth at 19,000 manors, the poor knights at 9,000. I don't know what a manor is in terms of money. Maybe he's saying that they had I don't know what the unit of money there is. Or is he saying that they had that many houses? Yet the latter was undoubtedly the richer order. All orders had confratres who led an ordinary life but spent certain periods in the houses, coming to the Brotherhood's assistance in a crisis. I guess he's saying houses. I guess he says he's saying they had 19,000 manor houses. Both Templar and Hospitaller rules made provision for married brothers to live at preceptories with their wives in special quarters, though in practice this was very rare. All brothers received valuable privileges, and consequently there were several thousand honorary Templars in Europe, many of them rich men. Philip le Bel of France was famous for his good looks, but beneath the thick yellow hair, his pale blue eyes reflected a chilly inhumanity. This is Philip IV. Secretive by nature, he was an enigma to his courtiers. His ambition was that France should take the empire's place. For this, he needed a subservient papacy and money. Okay, and then what happens is they had considered uniting all of the warrior monks orders into an order of Jerusalem. In other words, they would absorb the Templars and the Hospitallers and all these people into one order, and that they would be read by a so-called Rex Bellator, or a war leader king. Of course, the Templars did not want this, and they said no, and they voted against it because they already had all this power. And then what happened was, let's see, a secret appendix showed how the king might obtain control of the whole church through the cardinals, like in a coup d'etat. So Philip solemnly proposed to Rome that he himself should become the war leader king, the Rex Bellator, that the French kings be appointed hereditary masters of the Brethren of Jerusalem, that the surplus revenues of all orders be placed at his disposal. And this son of a bitch, right? You can see what he's doing. The Brethren, however, firmly rejected any suggestion of amalgamation. The fall of the imperial monarchy on page 210 had opened the way for national monarchies. Never again could a pontiff depose princes, arbitrarily summon Europe to a crusade, or protect clergy against an irate king. Philip's destruction of Boniface VIII marked the final collapse of papal pretensions. And it says, the decision to destroy the Templars was probably made by Philip's chancellor, Guillaume de Nogaret, a lawyer whose parents had been burned at the stake as Albigensian heretics. There you go. He had little love for Rome, and during the struggle with Pope Boniface was the king's chief instrument. He was also responsible for the royal finances. Of course he was. Suggestions that Philip feared a Templar coup d'etat are unrealistic. The order's combat troops were in Cyprus. Nogaret needed evidence. His first source was this guy, Esquisse de Florian of Béziers. He was once a Templar prior of Montfaucon, had been expelled for irregularities, probably a creeper, and during his efforts to obtain justice had committed at least one murder. This snitch offered to sell King Jaume of Aragon his former brethren's secret, accusing them of blasphemy and horrible vices. In other words, this snitch-ass little bitch, right, is a Templar. He's kicked out for irregularities, being a snitch and being a murderer. And then he sells his secrets to the king of Aragon, and he accuses them of blasphemy and horrible vices, probably to get back at him. And he's probably the one doing exactly what he's accusing people of. And then it says there was a memorandum. You can still read the memorandum where Pope Clement writes to the masters of the temple and Jacques de Molay and says, we wish to consult you about a crusade with the kings of Cyprus and Armenia. And Jacques de Molay answered with a detailed memorandum announcing that he would visit Clement to discuss the matter in detail. Was this when Clement was at Avignon? I think it was. No doubt he hoped to wrest the Crusades' leadership from the hospital. Clement did. He landed at Marseille in early 1307 with 60 knight brethren and rode to Paris in great state. In other words, they get this fake-ass letter from the Pope, right, that says, hey, we need your help. Come on and visit me. They go, they visit. They've got all this gold with them. And it says, among their baggage were 12 packloads of gold and silver, including 150,000 gold florins. Later, they were to regret this ostentation. King Philip gave them a warm welcome, but the Grand Preceptor of France knew something was in the wind. On the night of Thursday, October 12th, 1307, Philip's troops broke in to arrest Molay with 60 brethren, incarcerating some in royal prisons, others in the temple's own dungeons. And basically, at the same time, every Templar, the Templars are arrested all across Europe. Philip hoped to substantiate certain charges: denial of Christ, idol worship, spitting on the crucifix, and homosexuality. Unnatural vice was a practice associated with the Albigensians. And all these accusations were the stock and trade of heresy trials. The French Inquisition, staffed by Dominicans, hounds of the Lord, so-called, was expert at extracting the confessions. The brethren, unlettered soldiers, faced a combination of cross-examining lawyers and torture chambers, whose instruments included the thumbscrew, the boot, and the rack to dislocate limbs. Men were spread-eagled and crushed by lead weights or filled with water. They're waterboarded. There was also burning in the feet. Probably the most excruciating torments were the simplest: wedges hammered under fingernails, teeth wrenched out, and the exposed nerves prodded. The Templars would have resisted any torment by Muslims, but now, weakened by confinement in damp, filthy cells and systematic starvation, they despaired when the torture was inflicted by fellow Christians. Now, what I think, my interpretation of this, is that the Templars were hardened. These guys were hardened shock troops, and they knew very well that one of the, part of the risk of being in their order was that they could be captured by the infidel and by the Saracens and tortured to death. And they were willing to accept that. But what they could not accept was being tortured by their own people. And I think that that's part of the psychological, that's part of the Psy War that broke them. Because much has been made of the fact that they, signed their confessions. We all know about the signed confessions, under torture and under duress. But just like in the modern era, and just like in Phoenix, this is documented in Valentine's Phoenix program, the things that really get people to confess things, and this was sort of perfected by the likes of like Klaus Barbie and Mengele, was like this sort of trauma bonding, and the idea that one thing that Klaus Barbie did, if you're in a family situation right now, folks, put some earmuffs on, okay? One of the things that he did was to get people to confess. Barbie did this, the Butcher of Lyon did this, was that when they captured members of the French resistance, there's only so much information they could get by all of these, wild physical tortures, because they'll confess to anything. That's essentially what the Templars also did. They confessed to just anything, but they wouldn't get useful information in terms of like a war setting. So one thing they did was they would bring in a resistance guy, and they'd bring in a box, and they would say, "Here you go. We're letting you go. We even brought you a present." And the guy would open the box, and his wife's head would be in the box, right? That would break him. That would break his mind. And then Mengele perfected the thing of having family members come in and kill other family members, which would completely break down their psyche, break their mind and their spirit, and they'd be willing to do anything. So much has been made of like the physical, torture and all this stuff. And I'm sure that, plays a huge factor. But in terms of like the real breaking, we can see that with the Templars, right? We can see with the Templars what this did, which was the treachery from their own side. It's not surprising that 36 brethren died during the torture, or that out of 138 examined, 123 confessed to the least nauseating charges. Spitting on the crucifix, for medieval man was accustomed to swearing oaths under duress and then obtaining absolution once he was safe. Even Jacques de Molay stooped to this stratagem, humiliated by a charge of homosexuality, which he furiously denied. Hugh de Pay, let's see. They declared that he worshipped an idol in one of the chapters. At Carcassonne, two brethren agreed that they had adored a wooden image called Baphomet, while a Florentine Templar named it Mahomet, like Muhammad, and another brother said it had a long beard and no body. Royal agents hunted frantically for Baphomet and discovered a metal-plated skull suspiciously like a reliquary. The Baphomet story may have been inspired by a hospitaller practice of venerating a representation of the severed head of their patron, John the Baptist, sometimes flanked by the sun and the moon. This was painted on a panel like an icon, while it was also the seal of the Hospitallary Priory of England. So what I think is that, remember that occurred in the Northmen, where they're worshiping this disembodied head. And I think that, and Jay's brought this up before, I think that they may have, we see this with Skull and Bones and the skull of Geronimo and all this stuff. And I think that, they may have venerated the head of John the Baptist, or a representation of the head of John the Baptist. One of the other things was that they worshipped a disembodied head, or an idol, which was a picture. But But in another book I read on the Templars, it talks about how they had essentially I don't know if it was the actual Shroud of Turin, but they had they venerated, or one of the central symbols in their rituals was a depiction of Christ. And so they used that to say that they were worshiping an idol. And the picture of, now I don't know. I mean, maybe they were, maybe they were, and maybe in their weird Gnostic ceremonies they were doing this. I would say almost certainly that is probably what the accusers were actually doing in real life. I mean, look at Gilles de Rais and, the Spider King and all these, perverts who, practice blatant black magic and witchcraft. And I'm going to try to, if you can see this image right here, that's their image of John the Baptist with the sun and the moon on either side. And that's the symbol for the priory in England and the Hospitallers. And so they took that as their symbolism to say that they were worshiping this disembodied head. It says, when one considers how the Templars fought and died throughout the Crusades, it seems hard not to believe in their innocence, right? Good point. Only 3 brethren would confess to homosexual practices, a refutation of indecent kisses. It was alleged that in the rite of profession, postulants were required to kiss their superior on the navel or the base of the spine. Possibly a few preceptors indulged in, this guy says, mumbo jumbo, but it's highly unlikely. And intensive research fails to find the, quote, secret rule. Now, this is one reason why I have a problem with this book, because anytime when you have a work of historical analysis, and the guy is an admitted hospitaller, and then he says that he doesn't even specifically state the rituals they were accused of, and he calls it mumbo jumbo, that's when I start to be a little suspicious of the researcher or the analyst himself here. And I think that why not just say the rituals? I mean, we know the rituals, right? We know from, the Crowleyan Gnostic rituals of the inversion and the stuff that he was involved in, that is actually what they were accused of. And maybe that's true. And I hope not. But I'm sure that there obviously were Gnostic sects that were doing this. The Albigensians were doing this. I think the Cathars were doing this. And you have these devilish, sick perverts doing this sort of black magic, combined with the corporation aspect of domination of this land, their overlords, and the banking system. I mean, that's what we see today, right? Then again, it has to be kept in mind that, the Templars were destroyed, right? They were destroyed. They were destroyed for this. And who took it on and carried that on? It seems like it's been carried on by the accusers, right? They're the ones who incorporated the wealth and moved it into, centralizing and consolidating power in Europe. Anyway, they basically arrest all the Templars everywhere. A bunch of people refused to ratify. My direct ancestors, Robert the Bruce, never legally ratified the Scottish Temple's dissolution. Some of the Teutonic Knights actually marched in and declared that Clement was a heretic. They never listened to him in the first place, and that they were willing to do trial by combat to refute the charges. There's a trial, and Jacques de Molay makes a couple of mistakes in the trial. He refuses to defend himself in the trial because he says that he's not given evidence, and then they use that against him, and then he ends up recanting along with all hundreds of other guys, recanting all of their so-called confessions. Right, on page 218. It says they were supposed to have summoned devil women from hell and slept with them, while bastards were roasted in front of images smeared with children's fat, and cats were worshipped. That sounds like pure, this sounds like pure Gnostic Satanist, Aleister Crowley, Baal worship, pervert, devil, creeper, just degradation, right? And I think that that's probably the people that are accusing that are doing it. So Molay's last words before he's burned to death: I think it's only right that at so solemn a moment where my life has little time to run, I should reveal the deception which has been practiced and speak up for the truth. Before heaven and earth, and with all of you here as my witnesses, I admit that I'm guilty of the grossest iniquity. But the iniquity is that I've lied in admitting the disgusting charges laid against the order. I declare, and I must declare, that the order is innocent. Its purity and saintliness is beyond question. I have indeed confessed that the order is guilty, but I have done so only to save myself from terrible tortures by saying what my enemies wish me to say. Other knights who have retracted their confessions have been led to the stake, yet the thought of dying is not so awful that I shall confess to foul crimes which have never been committed. Life is offered to me, but at the price of infamy. At such a price, life is not worth having. I do not grieve that I must die if life can be bought only by piling one lie upon another. So that's it. That's what happens to the Templars. They are destroyed. That's where we get Friday the 13th. That's where they're destroyed. And all of their wealth is incorporated and stolen by Philip IV and various people throughout Europe. They set up the banking system that we know today. And I'd say that is where the point of, many of the things that we see in today's world come into existence. And again, this is a poem. I'm just going to read this to sort of close out here. You guys, make sure you please, thank you everybody for being here again. Please smash that like. Please leave me a comment. Please go to all my friends' channels and like their stuff and share their stuff, especially the Green Feathers and his painting, which is amazing. And Slow Boy Whiteboard and all of her based content, Jerry at Exposing Powerful Lies. Of course, everybody here is already, it's JD, Jay's Analysis, and David Patrick Carey, Church of the Eternal Logos, and Tristan at Primal Edge Health, all of our homies. Stay tuned for next week, you guys, because I'm going to be doing a stream, an analysis of a movie. I'm not going to say what the movie is yet, but it's going to be awesome. With our friend West Lexicon Media at Alternate Current Radio, our homie over there that we did an interview with before. Stay tuned for more stuff. The channel is going to look a lot different coming soon. It's going to be upgraded, leveled up, level 33 times infinity alpha, E-Celeb Chad level based. It'll look cool. Shouts out to all my homies out there. Please follow our homie Mixkey at Tech Noir Graphics at Instagram. Also Jethro, our homeboy Jethro at Instagram, Meme Kang. Rachel, Based Homeschool Mom, and the Crucible. Shouts out to all of our friends out there, right? ADH. Shouts out to Jamie and Jamie's channel with Kristen over there. It's awesome content as usual. Happy birthday, by the way, to Jamie. And I'm going to close this out with thank you for supporting me, by the way. Let's see. I think so. Somebody dropped me a little super chat here. Let's see. Yes. Shouts out to Derek for dropping me $5 on Venmo. Really appreciate you. Again, thank you to Kristen for always supporting me on Cash App. Really appreciate you. Shouts out to everybody who's supported me. I love you guys. And please, if you're watching this now, you can still support me at Cash App, Venmo, PayPal. Just click that link. Drop me a couple bucks. I really appreciate it. I need it. I know everybody needs it, but we need it. I need it. I need it with for books, for material to help the channel keep going. And we're going to keep this going anyway. I love doing this, and it's great. And I love hanging out with you guys. And shouts out to all of my homies out there. So I'm going to end this with a poem by Rimbaud from his book Illuminations. This is, let's see, he wrote this in, what was it? 1854 to 1891. I think 1871 is when he wrote this poem. 6% for 84. Yeah. By 1871. It's called Morning of Drunkenness. This deals with the assassins. This is where I first learned the word assassin, dealing with hashishin, which we just talked about. He says, "Oh, my good. Oh, my beautiful. Appalling fanfare where I do not falter. Rack of enchantments. Hurrah for the wonderful work and for the marvelous body for the first time. It began in the midst of children's laughter, and with their laughter it will end. This poison will remain in all our veins, even when the fanfare turning, we shall be given back to the old disharmony. Oh, now may we, so worthy of these tortures, fervently take up that superhuman promise made to our created body and soul, that promise, that madness, elegance, science, violence. They promise to bury in darkness the tree of good and evil and to deport tyrannic respectability so that we might bring hither our very pure love. It began with a certain disgust and ends unable instantly to grasp this eternity. It ends in a riot of perfumes. This is from the point of view of the assassins, right? Laughter of children, discretion of slaves, austerity of virgins, loathing of faces and objects here. Holy be all of you in memory of this vigil. It began with every sort of boorishness. Behold, it ends with angels of flame and of ice. Little drunken vigil, holy. If only because of the mask you have bestowed on us, we pronounce you method. We shall not forget that yesterday you glorified each one of our ages. We have faith in the poison. We know how to give our whole life every day. Now is the time of the assassins. So that's a poem in the viewpoint of one of these old man of the mountain assassins, right, that we just read about. And of course, now is the time of the assassins. The Time of the Assassins was a book that Henry Miller wrote about a study of Rimbaud. So anyway, that will conclude our analysis of the Crusades. We didn't really talk about each crusade, but what the point of the stream again was to discuss the Templars, the origins of the Templars, the accusations and the rituals, and what the Templars have, their legacy, and the Templars and the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, and what they were and existed for all this time. And who knows? I mean, I think that we can come up with our own sort of thoughts and a thesis statement according to the text here. But like it says in this book was written in 1972, published in 72. And even with that, there's only so much that's been written about the Templars. Now, one good thing is that there continues to be, publication every year, and that there is a wide body of knowledge from the era itself, which is another one of the good things about the time period, that we do have the written word dealing with this stuff. But I think the important thing is that we make our own we make our conclusions on this, and that we see what it has, its outcomes today in the world, and this world that we live in. And and certainly the idea of of virtue and of fighting for your faith, right? Of fighting for your faith, and not compromising with the degeneracy and the evil that we see in the world, is something that we continue to hold dear, right? So anyway, that'll do it, guys. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you all, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one, which will probably be an Elvis stream, and of course again next week. So peace out there. I hope you all have an awesome weekend and a great night and a beautiful Sunday. So I love you guys. Peace.